Hello, Team Freedom. Patrick here. It's about time I come clean about the Postal Service lawsuits we have. There's now two of them, and I may as well just review this briskly. In 2020, you may remember a whistleblower came forward named Jesse Morgan. He was a trucker who said that he had been given a strange trucking load, and he looked into it and he found some funny things. I'm going to walk you through what really happened there. What really happened there is this. When I built Overstock, we had an issue where sometimes you would buy what you tried not to, but you would get gray goods, and this is how that worked. And believe me, this will translate directly into discussing ballots. Somebody would go, North Face would go to Taiwan and have some factory make 10,000 sleeping bags for them. North Face, under license to North Face, so forth. That factory would stay open an extra weekend and run off another 2,000 sleeping bags. And then they would go into the market and sell them as North Face sleeping bags. Now, and you at a great price and as a discount, we would buy them. Well, it turns out, but it would turn out that they weren't. Well, they were North Face. It was the same factory, the same paperwork, the same labels, the same employees had done it. They were not actually produced under license to North Face, and so that was called gray goods. And keeping that stuff out of our supply chain was a full-time job for one lawyer, who was always looking at paperwork. Well, in the creation of ballots, the same thing happened in 2020. There was a ballot company in Michigan who won a bunch of contracts to print ballots for this county and that county all over America, about 20 different states. What they were doing was if they got a contract to print 200,000 ballots for one county, they would print up 300,000 and take those extra 100,000 and they would ship them off to Europe, to New York, to a place called Flushing, New York, which has a long history with the radical left. There was a facility there, 100 people in a room associated with a union called SEIU, filling those ballots out. And the same thing was going on with all the counties that this printing company in Michigan supplied. So these people would fill them out, a very well-organized effort, would be filling them out, and then they were sent to Bethpage, New York. And at Bethpage, New York, there was a facility on Grumman Road, I believe it was called, where these were taken and they were reintegrated into the mail. They were integrated into the mail system as possible. Now, the Bethpage, New York facility is a postal station, but is not set up to handle first-class mail, and ballots are first-class mail. And if you're going to handle first-class mail, you need something called an Oregon machine. But they don't have an Oregon machine. But they were handling first-class mail, and they were putting them in Gaylords. What is a Gaylord? A Gaylord, there's a picture of a Gaylord on the front of this, associated with this video. A Gaylord is a box or a big canvas version of a shopping cart, but much bigger. And it's on wheels, 4 wheels. And anytime you do warehouse work where you're moving lots of letters or packages, they get put in things called Gaylords, and then you move these boxes on wheels. We're to think of them as very big shopping carts, sometimes made with canvas walls on wheels, and that's what you move around the warehouse. So each Gaylord holds 50 to 100,000 ballots. Between October 18th and October 21st of 2020, 8 trucks came in from a company called Area Road and Trucking, and they were filled up with Gaylords, 20 to 30 Gaylords, and sent on their way to Lancaster, PA. One day, on one of those 3 days, in mid-late October 2020, a trucking company, a different trucking company, its truck pulled in. It was called 10 Roads Trucking, and driven by a guy named Jesse Morgan. And somebody at the facility made a mistake, and they loaded those ballots onto his truck, the wrong company's truck. he got the paperwork and it said, truck this to Lancaster, PA. He trucked it to Lancaster, PA. That was the guy. His name was Jesse Morgan. He got to Lancaster, PA. He was kept waiting for 6 hours because the paperwork wasn't from the right company and whatever hoo-ha. He went in the back of his truck and he found 20 Gaylords. It may have been 20, as much as 27 Gaylords. Well, if each one holds, if there were only 20 and each one held only 50,000, the truth is they can hold up to 100,000 ballots. 20 Gaylords and 50,000 ballots, that's 1 million ballots. And by the way, these ballots, they were filled in and the outside envelopes were signed. And that's because in this facility in Flushing, New York, there were 100 union folks sitting there at tables filling out ballots for Joe Biden and signing the outside of the envelope. Of course, so that was the supply chain that got them from a printing company that was deliberately printing up gray goods, extra ballots, getting them to this left-wing group in Flushing, New York, who was filling them out and signing them, to a postal facility in Bethpage, New York, that wasn't supposed to be handling first-class mail, but yet it was handling ballots, which were first-class mail, loading them into a truck, getting them to Lancaster, PA, and there they were entering the mail system as mail-in ballots. Well, that one Jesse Morgan truck had at least 1 million ballots in it. It may have had 1.5 million ballots in it. He went back and he looked at, and that's what he found when he went back in. There were 20 to 27 Gaylords, each with 50 to 100,000 ballots. We could determine later by weight, and so a minimum of 1 million, probably more like 1.5 million ballots. And remember, that was one of 9 trucks. We know there were 8 other trucks from some other company. So 8 or 9 times 1 million is 8 to 9 million, but it may have been 9 times 1.5 million or more. So it may have been more like 12, 13 million ballots or mail-in ballots were integrated into the mail system through this chain that I just described. And that's just in the North. We think there was something similar going on in the South, involving a company called Runbeck. Different story. But that's what happened in 2020. And that's this whistleblower who came forward. Now that whistleblower came forward and he told this story. He was immediately picked up by the feds, held in some, basement for 9 hours, questioned. And the feds came out with a piece of paper saying he just signed something that retracted the statement he had given. He immediately came out and said, look, I was in the underground with these feds and they berated me for 9 hours trying to get me to retract my story. They reached the point they said they were going to kill me and my family or something. And at that point, to get out of it, I said I withdraw, and I signed something that says I take this back. That was so I didn't get killed in this basement. I came out, and I'm telling you folks the truth. It absolutely was the truth, what I had to say. We investigated that, and we had the wonderful John Moynihan, part of the America Project, as a 25-year federal officer from the DEA, but now he's going to have private kind of a specialty practice, and he does odd investigations. We have affidavits from people who were involved, people who worked in the Bethpage facility. We have the whole chain of command mapped out. But the last thing we needed was, okay, tell us who paid for those trucks. Now it gets interesting. So now I'm giving you history. If you've been following my videos over the years, you will have heard a lot of this, maybe not all of it. I've never really put it all together for everybody, because I'm giving you this history and then giving you a new development in the last month that's big. So for 4 years, we fought with the Postal Service to say, okay, who paid for that truck? Somebody paid for those trucks. And we think it was the DNC, or it's going to turn out to be Kleiner Perkins and some DNC front company paid for all this. They have fought turning that over like it's the nuclear codes to turn over that information. In the process of the Postal Service fighting to turn that over, some really funny things came out. One of them is that federal agencies, so the Postal Service takes a picture of every first-class mail that comes through. There's a digital picture. There's huge server farms the Postal Service maintains where everything's really recorded, all the movement of every piece of paper. If we're correct, there's 10 to 12, 13 million ballots out there, which there will be no digital photos for of how they got it, if they really got into the system naturally, people just turning them in. There'd be a digital photo trail along the way of all of those ballots. There is none because they're not legitimate. They were created like I just described, taken to a postal facility not legally able to handle first-class mail, and then reintegrated into the mail system as I just described. They would provide no information on the background of those 12 million ballots, and including who paid for the trucking. Because if it turns out it was the DNC or Kleiner Perkins who paid for those trucks, then that kind of answers everything. Well, the branches of the parts of the executive branch, they all have, whether you're talking about the IRS, you're talking about the EPA, they all have a documents retention policy, just like any company does. And a publicly traded company has to maintain all documents for six years. So if a lawsuit comes in or the SEC comes in, you can sort of recreate everything that's happened in every part of the company for 6 years. And that's what the federal government has. In 2020, in March or April of 2020, 9 months before the election, the Postal Service changed their document retention policy, how long they keep documents, from a 6-year look back to a 90-day look back. Okay, 90 days, maybe even 30 days on some types of things. They got through, and they got through the election, got 30 to 90 days out, claimed to have destroyed all their documents related to the election. And then they changed their look back policy to 6 years again. They changed it from 6 years to 90 days, during 2020, got through the election, got everything destroyed, and then changed it back to 6 years. Well, there's something called the Administrative Procedures Act, I think it's 1971, which says when a federal agency changes some administrative procedure, how it works is it publishes to the public, we're considering changing some rule, and the public has 60 days to study it and 30 days to write their feelings about that and what they want. And then the agency has, it's this very formal process, has 30 days where they come back and they propose a new rule, and then the public has another comment period, blah, blah, blah. And then finally the agency publishes its rule. They didn't do any of that as they changed these procedures. The only way they can get around doing those things is the Administrative Procedures Act does allow for a regulator or administrative part of the government to change its procedures without going through that rigmarole if they get the sign-off of a federal judge. And the Postal Service had, in fact, in 2020, gotten the sign-off of a federal judge. That federal judge is Emmett Sullivan. And if you've been paying attention, Emmett Sullivan is the very strange judge who oversaw the Mike Flynn fiasco for the DOJ, where they hounded Mike Flynn, a decorated 3-star general. They hounded him for 4 years, 5 years, saying they hounded him. He at one point the media was like to say, well, he pled guilty. He did submit a guilty plea for a nothing burger offense when they threatened his son with 25 years. But he got into it and he withdrew the guilty plea. The media will never tell you that. He withdrew the guilty plea, fought it on. Eventually the DOJ got a retired judge to come in and look at the whole case. They said this whole case is trumped up. It should never have been brought. But this guy, Emmett Sullivan, he had never accepted the guilty plea, which is why when people say Flynn is a convicted felon, he's not a convicted felon. He submitted a guilty plea to a felony. The judge didn't accept it. The judge savored it like a fine wine and danced around for months so the media could say, we have a guilty plea from Michael Flynn. Well, because he took so long, that gave Michael Flynn time as he learned more, and in particular learned how crooked the case was that had been fabricated against him. He withdrew the guilty plea. So that judge never accepted the guilty plea, which means Mike Flynn is not. He was never convicted. They never accepted the plea. They fought it on, and a retired judge from St. Louis or somebody came in and looked at it all and said this whole thing is a big lark, and the DOJ, and it should never been brought, and the DOJ dropped the case. That's the judge, Emmett Sullivan, who refused to let it drop and said, well, I'm going to prosecute Michael Flynn. Well, that's not how prosecutions work. The judge is the neutral judge, and the government brings a case, and there's the defendant. A judge in American history has never said, I'm going to run my own prosecution of this guy. It was ridiculous. And that went on until Trump pardoned him out of this kangaroo court situation. That's Emmett Sullivan. That's the same judge who signed off in 2020 on this Mickey Mouse behavior from the Postal Service that let them destroy their records. I've just summarized a 4-year, multi-million-dollar fight, $2-3 million fight. People wonder what the American Project does. It funds so many things like this. It funded so many things like this. But that's, and now, and I'll be putting it online. I'll be putting it online, probably on Telegram is where I put a bunch of documents. I'll attach what I can to this locals broadcast. They finally, in like September, actually fighting that out, I'll tell you this with the Postal Service, it was so clear they were in the wrong that eventually they got a lawyer, not from the chief legal counsel of the U.S. Postal Service. All we had was a FOIA case, a Freedom of Information Act case in Washington, D.C., saying who paid for those trucks. Somebody paid for them. 10 Roads Trucking, Area Trucking didn't just do that on their own. Somebody paid for those trucks. Finally, judges, Obama appointees and Democratic judges who were involved in the process were telling the Postal Service, you have to turn that information over. Somewhere in there, the Postal Service finally turned over, and they kept saying, we don't have the information, we don't have the information. We were able to prove they did. They had it, and there were different ways it was buried. They finally turned over a sheet about the billings from that facility on those 3 dates in October of 2020. It was like the 18th, the 19th, and the 20th, I think. And they had whited out those 3 dates. And then they ended up saying, we will not turn over, not even with a judicial order, we will not turn over the information for those 3 dates. So, and in a normal world, that would be proof of guilt, long ago proof of guilt. Their own DOJ attorneys let us know, and in filings, they were ordering their people, their client, in this case the U.S. Postal Service, to turn the information over, and the client just wouldn't turn it over. Finally, they got an affidavit filed in September of this year from some guy who oversees and I'll include as much of this as I can in the notes, that you can look at these things yourself. An affidavit saying we don't have the data. Well, at this point, there's a judge, Dabney Friedman, in Washington, D.C., who's had enough. And she clearly doesn't believe them. There's nothing to believe. They've just stonewalled us and the judicial system for 4 years, turning over simple information, which makes us really confident what that information is something like who paid for that trucking that is going to turn out to be Kleiner Perkins or some other Democratic front paid for that. So, boom, with that as background, we filed a case in late August, again in Maryland, with a federal judge in Maryland against the Postal Service, and saying, look, they clearly cheated. They cheated on all these FOIA responses. They've been hiding this information. They're lying. They're clearly lying because time and again, we've proven that they have information that they claim they didn't have. And so we finally went to the Postal Service 2 months ago and said, we went to the judiciary 2 months ago and said the Postal Service cannot be involved in an election. Given what they did in 2020 and given how they've stonewalled and buried and refuse to answer these questions. They're clear, and there's so much evidence, including affidavits we have from people in that chain of command. They cannot be involved in the election of 2020. Incidentally, it's unconstitutional. You cannot have any part of the executive branch of the federal government involved in an election. That's like really clear law. And yet, so everything they've done, and of course, since Biden came to power, he created a special division of the Postal Service to be involved in elections. That's unconstitutional. So we brought all this, including the Postal Service's crooked behavior over the preceding 4 years, to a federal judge in Maryland and said, enjoined them from being involved in this election. That judge has taken this very seriously. They tried to get it dismissed. It wasn't dismissed. And now that judge has ordered on Thursday or Friday, 2 days ago, we called for an emergency injunction against the Postal Service, and the judge has granted it. So coming up, I believe, early this week, there's a hearing on a federal judge's injunction against telling the Postal Service they can't be involved in this election. Well, given how close we are to the election, it's highly unlikely the judge is going to go along with that remedy. But a lesser remedy is to say, okay, then you have to demand radical transparency right now out of the Postal Service on all the movement of everything ballot related for this election. Otherwise, they're just going to stuff like crazy the mail-in ballots and present us with a fait accompli like they did in 2020. And no one will have any reason to judge to trust these elections. So you just have to demand radical, judge, you have to order immediately on an emergency injunction, radical transparency into everything in the Postal Service involved with moving ballots. That's where things stand. That was filed on Thursday or Friday. I believe it was granted, and I believe this week there is an emergency hearing in a Maryland court. And by the way, the head of the Postal Service the Postmaster General lives in Maryland, and that gives us reason to have filed this in Maryland. And my understanding is we have a judge, not a friendly judge in Maryland, but a non-crooked judge in Maryland, and he's taking the Postal Service is trying to get this kicked out or squashed, and the judge is having none of it. So there's a hearing coming up this week in a federal courtroom in Maryland where we're asking a judge, at the very least, I mean, what you really should do is just say you cannot be involved in any election, which is incidentally what the law and the Constitution says. But if he's not going to do something that extreme a remedy this late in the game, he certainly has the capacity to change things by demanding radical transparency immediately within the Postal Service for inspection for any movement of ballots in this election. So I have given that as tersely and concisely as I can. I will attach to I'll put this up in Locals, I'll put it up other places too, but I will attach to it links to associated reading for further reading. Okay? So, sorry we've been playing this so close to the vest. I've spoken for a long time of a royal flush. This has been the royal flush. And the ace was finding out, I mean, we actually put together, we know where those fake ballots, well, that's just a thing, they weren't fake ballots. They were ballots printed in a real printing company that was in on the fix up in Michigan. And just like that, when I give you the North Face tent example or sleeping bag example from Taiwan, those sleeping bags aren't fake, but in a sense they're fake. They're just not. You see what I mean? They're fake. I mean, they're manufactured out of license. That's what makes them gray good. Well, our system is awash in gray good ballots. They don't have to be made in China. This stuff about them being printed in China, back in 2020, I don't know if any of that's true. Although we did see places where there were Chinese indications of Chinese printing. But the main event is not that they're printed somewhere else. They can be printed in the actual facility that's supposed to be printed ballots, but they're just doing overruns, and they're using those overruns to feed into the system this way. We know what happened in 2020. The only parts we don't know are the parts that they have broken the law by erasing, by shielding, by stonewalling for 4 years. for 4 years. And shame on the federal judiciary. This has only happened because it's taken 4 years, and they still, through their mechanism, could not let us get to the true bottom of anything. But given the behavior of the Postal Service, it's clear that they were involved in massive, fraud on a 10 to 13 million vote level back in 2020. I think they're stepping it up for this election. So this is the hijacking of the country gets complete if it isn't stopped, and it has to be stopped right now. And we have all the information for further reading, and it is now in front of a federal judge in Maryland where we're seeking at least a federal injunction against demanding radical transparency, if not eliminating the Postal Service from this game at all, which is really what the right solution is. Okay, so further reading attached. I'll put up this video a few places. If you want the links for further reading, you have to find my Locals account. Okay, Patrick Byrne signing off.